Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons Sarah Turner and Alexander Lashley. For as little as $3, you can gain access to Patreon-only episodes, as well as access to our Discord server, where we host weekly live discussions with host Ikoi Hero and myself. So if you like what you hear, come join us at patreon.com/It's Not Just In Your Head. Please do rate us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on social media. We're on Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode or the podcast in general, then email itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. This week, psychotherapist Dr. Harriet Fraad and addiction and substance use disorder counsellor Ikoi Hero are joined by Dr. Joanna Moncrieff, critical psychiatrist, researcher, and author of a straight-talking introduction to psychiatric drugs, the truth about how they work and how to come off them.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
We can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
There's a great quote. People have to make judgments about whether to start using a psychiatric drug on the basis of totally inadequate information. And I think your book absolutely outlines how that situation maybe has also come about. This information is not clear. So I thought maybe if we maybe follow some sort of form or structure similar to how you outlined it in the book. Like, I wondered if you'd mind talking about the sort of existing model or idea in psychiatry, the disease-centered model, and what it assumes and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so the central idea of my book and of my work over the last couple of decades now is this idea that we fundamentally misunderstand what psychiatric drugs are doing. Psychiatric drugs being the drugs that are prescribed to people who have mental health problems. So that includes drugs like antidepressants, but also antipsychotics given to people with schizophrenia and psychosis, and benzodiazepines used for anxiety, and drugs that are referred to as mood stabilizers and stimulants as well. And so the fundamental misunderstanding is this: the conventional way of thinking about these drugs is thinking that they work by reversing or rectifying in some way an underlying biological abnormality or mechanism that produces the symptoms of the disorder. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that an antidepressant works by reversing the underlying abnormality that produces symptoms of depression, whether that be a deficiency of serotonin, as people have been told for a long time, or a deficiency of noradrenaline, which was what was the main theory before the serotonin theory, or some abnormality of neural networks or neurogeneration, which are fashionable ideas nowadays. And it's the same for the other main classes of psychiatric drugs. And that is reflected in the names that we give to drugs. So we talk about antidepressants, drugs that are thought to treat depression specifically. We talk about antipsychotics and mood stabilizers. We don't anymore talk about drugs in terms of the sorts of alterations that they produce. We used to refer more commonly to drugs as sedatives or stimulants, for example. And that's the other way that I suggest that drugs could be working, and that I suggest that they are working. And that's what I've called the drug-centered model of drug action. And it's the idea that these drugs change the normal state of the brain and thereby change normal mental states and behaviors. And the easiest way to think about this is to think of recreational drugs. These are drugs that we know change the normal state of brain chemistry, change behaviors, sensitivity, feelings, and those alterations in people's behavior and feelings are superimposed onto their underlying feelings. So we have a phrase in English I'm sure you're familiar with. We refer to using alcohol to drown your sorrows. And that's the idea that the alterations that are produced by alcohol are superimposed on your underlying sad feelings, and and temporarily your underlying feelings are therefore replaced and obscured. So that is the drug-centered model of drug action, and it recognizes that the drugs that we prescribe for mental health problems are what we could describe as mind-altering or psychoactive drugs, by virtue of the fact that they are drugs that change the normal state of the brain. And they all cause alterations, different sorts of alterations in our mental experience and our behavior.
Yeah, there was a quote there that made me fall off my chair when I was reading it. No one would suggest alcohol works by reversing an underlying biochemical imbalance or correcting insufficiency of alcohol in the brain. I was like, well, there might be a few people who say like, yeah, I haven't got enough alcohol in my brain. But yeah, I thought it was sort of a profound example of a way of framing it that I certainly hadn't come across before.
And I suppose the important thing to say about these models is that there really is no evidence to justify the disease-centered model of drug action. The drug-centered model is I think our sort of default normal understanding of what drugs that affect the brain are likely to do when they're taken by someone who has a mental health problem, who's distressed or anxious or whatever. We would normally think of, taking a psychoactive drug as producing changes that might temporarily obscure those underlying feelings. And the disease-centered model is something that is saying something quite new and different that really needs substantiating. And none of the drugs that we have been shown conclusively anyway to work in this disease-centered way.
Yeah.
Right. And that's profound, really, because the impression I get is that on the ground, the feeling is the reverse, right? That most people have internalized a disease-centered model.
Yeah, absolutely, because people have been told this. There's been an enormous amount of pharmaceutical company funded propaganda which has put this idea about and basically squashed any other way of thinking about psychiatric drugs.
Well, where there's a disease, there's presumably a cure, and therefore they're marketed as a cure, which they're not.
Yes.
The substance use disorder has also been framed as a brain disease in most of treatment settings.
And it's fascinating the way that someone conceptualizes that, because on one hand, it can be a relief, right? Like, it's not me, it's this sort of thing inside me that isn't made right. But there was a really great bit, I think, towards the end of your book, where you're talking about that the problem with that sort of mindset is just that if you are taking a particular psychiatric drug, that you can then believe that if your life starts to improve in some meaningful way to you, that then you can believe it's the drug, and then you don't ever want to come off it, and you might not recognize that you were instrumental in that change, right? Absolutely. And so you lose a sort of sense of confidence, and that then there's a sort of dependency on it. I mean, Ikoi, I'm just wondering if you've sort of experienced that with clients or.
Well, I mean, especially in substance use treatment, like they say that addiction is like chronic and permanent. And again, how individuals perceive that is very, very different. I don't necessarily buy into the brain disease model. I feel that it's too reductive.
Yeah, of course.
That it doesn't put into the environmental aspect of psychological behavior and development. So for people that find extreme relief in it, I generally it's like, if that helps you, that helps you. But I have had people that were like, oh my God, like, are you telling me this is a permanent condition that I'm never going to get rid of?
It's a really, really serious thing to tell someone that they have a brain disease, or even to imply that some abnormality in their brain, isn't it? And personally, I feel we have to have very good evidence that that is the case before we go around suggesting to people that, they might have something wrong with their brain.
Well, one question that really does strike me is, since UK has a public healthcare system and therefore doesn't have the cabal of the really capitalist cabal of big pharma, plus insurance, plus hospitals, plus doctors working as a foursome for profit, why would they fall for the model? Is it just American hegemony?
That's a good question. I think, obviously the pharmaceutical industry has had an interest in promoting this model since the 1990s. Beforehand, they worked with other models, but since the 1990s, it's been a really key part of their marketing. But they're not the only group with an interest in promoting it. So I think the psychiatric profession bear responsibility as well. The psychiatric profession have, very much wanted to boost their medical credentials and tell people that they're dealing with proper diseases and they've got proper medical treatments like the rest of medicine. So they've been part of promoting it. And I also think that it's a convenient story for governments as well, for governments of all political varieties, actually. Rather than having to admit that actually there are lots of people out there who are really unhappy with how things are, whose lives are not working out, who are really struggling. It's easier for governments to think, they've got a medical condition and we can give that to the medical experts and the therapists and everyone else to deal with.
That's true.
It's an expedient model.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes. The US and the UK have, in parallel fashion, immiserated their own people as they've accumulated more and more money at the top of a capitalist oppressive class. And so that it would be convenient to try to convince the mass of people that you've immiserated that there's something wrong with their collective brains, and not with the process of immiseration and denial that has impoverished them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well put.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, because I guess in previous conversations, episodes of the podcast and stuff, there's been talk of people, I guess, in really tough circumstances, either, they're traumatized or they're just in tough economic, situation, sort of following on from what you guys are saying. And I think Ikoi, you've said this before, there's people who feel like the medication they take enables them to get out of bed and go to work. And without it, they feel that they'd be homeless, everything would fall apart.
Right. Or that's been kind of their history, right? That, they get stabilized and then they go off medication and they end up homeless.
Right.
That's been a repeated pattern, or that is a real potential possibility.
Yeah, I think we should move on. We should go to the subject of going off medications, because there's a substantial part of your book where you talk about that, which is fascinating. But just while we're on this subject, I thought there was an example in your book about 2 Israeli doctors. I'm not sure what the substance was that they took, but it was pretty terrifying. And I thought it spoke exactly to that experience that you had mentioned, Ikoi, which is that, these guys took, Joanna, do you remember what the substance was?
Yeah, it was an antipsychotic. I think it was haloperidol that they took, and it was probably back in the 1960s or 70s, wasn't it?
Is the Taldol, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they felt really debilitated and demotivated and really couldn't do anything. Or they could do things if they were told exactly what to do, but they couldn't find the initiative to do fairly simple things themselves.
Right, which feeds into, if you have a job that just literally pays the bills, but you just have to do it and it's meaningless, a substance that allows you to just follow instruction and zone out is kind of pretty useful. However, I don't know if that particular drug they took actually translates to the current drugs on the market. I have no idea, but
So haloperidol is still used for people with schizophrenia and psychosis, but it's not widely prescribed to the rest of the population.
Right. So it's probably a
commonly.
Yeah, but I think drugs like drugs like benzodiazepines and barbiturates were very widely prescribed. They are sedatives that make people, feel more relaxed and probably enable people to tolerate higher levels of stress than they would be able to otherwise. Antidepressants are fairly mild psychoactive drugs, but probably have this emotional blunting effect. So again, make people less sensitive to things that that are going wrong in their lives, or potentially make people less sensitive to difficulties in their relationships or difficulties at work. So I think the principle that psychiatric drugs generally make people less sensitive to pain and mental pain and situational difficulties is probably correct.
Well, one of the things that this reminds me of is when I was in the Occupy movement, there were veterans who came and who said after PTSD, this was the best cure they ever had. Protest. And
yes.
I think one of the things that these drugs do that capitalism really likes, in addition to the huge profits raked in by the hospitals, doctors, and insurance companies and pharmaceuticals, is that there is a crushing weight of realization that you are horribly exploited, screwed, and given few chances, and that the delusion of you can make it if you really try, and that you work hard, you will be rewarded, is one that has really disappeared in a lot of the population. And therefore, the misery is crushing. And neither the UK, especially after Corbyn's frame-up and Bernie's being stabbed in the back by the Democrats, there is no avenue for people to say, yes, we have been immiserated and we can be empowered, which would help to get over the awful sense of helplessness and desperation of realizing the crushing weight of capitalism's exploitation of people. I think in some other countries where there's more viable political action, even like, let's say, France or Chile right now, since they won incredibly, or Colombia, that there is less of the demand to be cured by drugs and less of a push on people's part to think that it's a brain problem instead of a social problem, because there's a social alternative and a way of achieving it that's out there for them. Do you think that has merit too?
Yes, our society, people have become so much more isolated, and our societies have become so much more fragmented. And like you say, there is less and less opportunity for people to take control of their lives together with other people and feel that they actually have some power and can change things and can help themselves. I think that's more and more difficult. There are fewer opportunities, as the trade unions have been crushed and all the left-wing movements have been betrayed, as you say, and drugs provide a convenient alternative, a convenient way of just doping people.
I wonder as well, like there's an automatic divide and conquer thing that's happening where, it's staggering to me that, because there's really interesting bit in the book where you talk about evidence and random controlled trials. And, you have this sort of academic structure or a sort of a corporate structure facilitating these studies. And the sort of level of deception is really obviously disturbing. But then coming back to my sort of point about like an automatic divide and conquer, it's like the trust in society just breaks down. Like no wonder everyone's like, oh, these, city elites, they're all assholes, whatever. It's like, well, yeah, like everyone's sort of collecting their paycheck, and I assume in these trials and stuff that they're well paid, particularly if they're backed by pharma companies, and so it's one of those things that ultimately goes that you reveal in your book basically that it's the tail end of this experience for the person on the psychiatric drugs, which isn't getting really anywhere near enough sort of study time or research done on it. And that's sort of fascinating. I assume it's not happening because it would sort of reveal certain things that would be uncomfortable. I don't know how these studies are funded.
Since the publication of the serotonin paper in July, I've become aware that there is a huge effort going on to suppress any discussion of what these drugs actually do to people, how they make people feel, how they might be changing people's brains, and as a consequence, changing people's mental states and feelings and things like that. The psychiatric establishment, backed by Big Pharma, really, really don't want people to know that. They don't want people to think about these drugs in that way. They just want people to think of them as, nice little medical treatments for the condition that they've been told that they have. And like you say, what's wrong with the system goes so deep, because all the studies that we've got that supposedly show that these drugs are helpful and effective are flawed from the very beginning, because they start with this idea that, you can put people in a box and say, oh, this person's got major depression, this person's got generalized anxiety disorder, as if you can parcel people's problems out like that. You can't. They also depend on the idea that we can measure people's feelings. That depression, there's such a thing as a measure of depression, that you can say that one person is twice as depressed as another person. That is also obviously absurd. So the whole machinery behind these drugs is flawed and corrupt as well. You refer to some of the corrupt practices like the pharmaceutical industry, burying negative studies, highlighting positive findings and suppressing negative findings.
And putting huge pressure on the researchers. I had a client who was a researcher and quit because there was an enormous pressure to come up with a positive outcome, even if it weren't merited.
Right, yes.
Because you could lose your job.
So basically, you show in the book that there are benefits and harms to any of these psychiatric drugs, and the benefits need to be considered and questioned, but the harms are pretty extensive, just in terms of the long-term effects that they have. So I'm just thinking, like, somebody might be listening to this who has been taking a particular medication for a very long time, and it might be kind of scary to hear. So you sort of do detail just a sort of broad strokes way of how you might decrease over time, withdraw. I wondered if you wanted to talk about that, and or Harriet or Ikoi, what your experience has been with people slowly coming off these medications, or not slowly, fast as well.
Can I just say something quickly, maybe about the adverse effects?
Sure.
I think, because like you say, it can be very scary, I think, for people to hear, maybe for the first time, that they're taking a drug that changes the normal state of the brain, changes their normal brain chemistry, and therefore is likely to have long-term harmful consequences of one sort or another. And drugs, all drugs do have harmful consequences, but some worse than others. And so you do have to take each drug individually. And I think the most important thing for everyone is to really think carefully about what they're getting out of a drug that they're using, and really whether they think that the drug is helping them more than it's harming them. And I think that's the first thing. Those are the first things that people need to think about when they think about whether they want to stay on or think about coming off a drug.
One of the things that clients have told me is they get brain zaps when they try to get off, little kind of electric charges, and they get horribly depressed. And if I have a client who wants to get off of drugs, I always tell them, you have to titrate your withdrawal. This messes with your brain. You have to go so slowly and then take a week off each time to see what's happening to you. Because these are powerful, although they're given out like M&Ms. You go to your doctor's office, no matter what kind of doctor, a foot doctor, they can give you a prescription.
I think, I mean, in terms of certain kinds of medications can be extremely hard to access. Benzodiazepines are becoming extraordinarily hard to access, which is unfortunate for people who have been on it for a long term, because sudden withdrawal can be like fatal, can cause seizures. And so, my opinion of benzodiazepines has always been people who have had long-term prescriptions should have easier access. We should be more cautious about giving out new prescriptions.
Yes.
The longer someone's been on something, generally, the more difficult it is to get off it, is
right.
my experience. And some drugs, like benzodiazepines, but also antidepressants, seem to be particularly difficult to get off in the sense that the withdrawal symptoms can be really protracted and debilitating.
Right.
Yeah, and also it was fascinating how studies around this idea of staying on medication and or coming off were completely compromised by, well, I would have thought it seemed kind of logical that, like, if someone is stopping medication, that there would be these problems that happen. And you go, well, maybe that's just sort of coming off the drug, right? Opposed to evidence that they need to keep taking the drug. Like, that sort of boggles my mind that on a sort of professional level that was accepted as.
So these studies were set up. They were branded as relapse prevention studies or maintenance treatment studies. So they were really put forward as if they were studies of starting on long-term treatment rather than discontinuing treatment. And of course, when you realize that actually these studies are not about starting on long-term treatment, they all involve people who've been on long-term treatment already for years, usually, and then randomizing half of them to come off and half of them to stay on. When you realize that they are actually discontinuation studies, as you say, it is obvious, isn't it, that the people in the discontinuation arm are going to have problems related to the discontinuation of the medication. So the study says nothing about the benefits of continuing on medication. It just tells you about what goes wrong when you stop it. And most of these studies involve relatively abrupt cessation of medication as well.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I've always, that I've heard through others, friends, and clients about even changing medication, stopping medication, et cetera, is that, there is very little regard for the withdrawal process from psychiatry. The tapering schedule is often too rapid. The step down's often too large. This is not a client, this is, somebody that I knew, but I know somebody that, started taking antidepressants after her mother passed away. And, obviously, that is a major event in the vast majority of people's lives that can cause a tremendous amount of grief. And she was also in a really important and stressful time during her career where she, really couldn't take the time out to grieve properly. And so she basically, her thinking was, I'll go on antidepressants and kind of get over this hump in my career, and then I'll go off them. But by the time she was able to be okay, I think it's time for me to go off these medications. She was on them for 5 or 6 years. She was, hoping it was going to be a 6 month, but it ended up, being 5 or 6 years. And the way she came off it was going through compounding pharmacies.
What's that?
Compounding pharmacies are private. There are pharmacies that can compound medication to a specific dosage rather than the standard dosage available in regular pharmacies, right?
What is compounding?
It just means they make up their own tablets.
I see.
They can make tablets that are very low strength, so that you can take it down really slowly as you get to the lower doses, because some of the antidepressants, such as venlafaxine, for example, Effexor's its brand name, the lowest dose is 37.5 milligrams, which is actually still a very strong dose, high dose, and it's very difficult for people just to stop the 37.5 and not have withdrawals and not have severe withdrawals.
So yeah, she went through compounding pharmacies, and she took, if I recall the conversation accurately, I think she told me she took about a year and a half of slowly titrating down.
Makes sense.
Right. Ultimately at a relatively high cost to her because compounding pharmacies aren't covered under most plans. So that this was all out of pocket.
Well, it seems just so, at a basic level, offensive that knowledge isn't given. The withdrawal information isn't present at the time that you are considering taking the psychiatric drug. And, again, this book and the information inside it is trying to sort of correct that and sort of give people information that they should know and that should be provided to them. Because the withdrawal thing, as you said, where it takes years to come off it for your friend, it's sort of a crime, right? By admission, by not including that stuff. It sort of reminds, I know this is really stupid and pithy, but gym memberships, they make it like a really easy in. And then when you want to try and cancel it, it's like, it's a 3 months in advance thing. And, we need to steal your house.
But there are thousands and thousands of people around the world who have had their lives ruined by trying to get off antidepressants and benzodiazepines. And we're never given any information that it was going to be this difficult. I mean, to be fair, we didn't know it was this difficult until, I would say, a few years ago. But we should have known. We really should have known. Because
that research.
Yeah.
But also, if you look at it, if we look at it in a cynical way, which I do look at this capitalist operation, if you want to hustle a product, you don't want to talk about how to get off it. You just want to talk about how to get on it and how to stay on it. You have fewer sales. And if you're a psychiatrist, with people's insurance, a psychiatrist who used to charge $600 an hour is not going to be able to charge that. So if all he does is become a psychopharmacologist, he sees a different person every 15 minutes instead of the hour, only talks to them about how they're feeling, and then occasionally redoes their prescription. He can get $150 an hour and see 6 people. So he's ahead financially. If you look at it as sales, as a capitalist collusion between mental hospitals and insurance companies and doctors and big pharma, you can see, by doctors, I mean psychiatrists, you can see the profit motive screaming. And a client of mine who's a psychiatric nurse who went to the nurses' convention said there were booths with neon lights advertising the different drugs because they can prescribe.
I do agree with you, Harriet, but I also think I think there are other motivations too. I mean, I think that as as a population, as a culture, Western culture, we have too much faith in medicine, and we do not question it enough. And we do want to believe that medicines are generally good, and we want to overlook any negative effects that they have. And we want to think that there's a solution, that there's a chemical solution for emotional problems, just as we want to think that, there's a cure for cancer and other things that probably don't actually exist. So I think that is also part of the mix. I mean, science and capitalism have gone together, so you could argue that sort of optimism is also political, but yeah, I think it's
right.
an attitude
I
to
mean,
science.
I don't think, it's not just the profit motivation. I think, the expedience model is baked into the medical model, right? And that's kind of carried over into the psychiatric spaces, because it's not as if, regular medicine is different in a sense that, like, when you go to the doctor, they don't describe potential adverse events of, you get a pamphlet, and if you read through the pamphlet, you'll understand the adverse events of any given medication. But people aren't generally taught in any way to be good, advocates and good, educated patients in general about anything about our health.
I think that's right. And Joanna's point about the expedience, I think, is also very much a statement about our culture that doesn't teach us that life is struggle, and things that are worth it take work and take time. And therefore, your mental health takes time to develop. And your problems are something you should think about. No, fix it.
Yeah.
And that's,
I mean, that's also like the technology focused model. There is, this very strong overriding, it's an ideology, right? That, we have technical fixes to everything that ails us, whether it's climate change, right? Or whether it is, our health. Here we, again, the medical model right now is an expedient symptom-based model. We need to get rid of the symptoms rather than address some of the overriding cause. Because whether the issue is like diabetes or mental health, providing like, I'm not necessarily anti-medication, but I am for pro-stability. I think one of the major issues with mental health right now is that, when you don't provide people the basic stability that they need, right? A roof over their head, their basic needs met, that you are actually also like shortchanging the medication's efficacy.
That's really key, Ikoi, because if you commodify basic needs like shelter and healthy food and rest and recreational possibilities and sleep for people, then you really are taking away health and prerequisites for health. And then you want to sell a product that promises what it can't deliver under these circumstances.
Right. You're just kind of delaying, the inevitable. Right.
Yeah.
So I think not providing these things, because that's part of why, the push for this expedience model is so strong, is that it kind of lets, society and government off the hook and allows them to continue the austerity model.
Exactly.
Right? Instead of providing for people, but ultimately, whatever one's opinions on medication in general, we are greatly shortchanging, even the most basic efficacy of any medication, oftentimes, by throwing people in a high stress, high stakes, fight for survival all the time.
Ikoi, I wanted to ask you to think about the substance misuse treatment model, because I think there's a lot that psychiatrists could learn from it, general psychiatrists, because when someone comes in for treatment for an alcohol problem or a heroin problem or something, part of the treatment is, because I've worked in substance misuse, is getting people to explore what the substance is doing for them, what role it has in their lives, and then, of course, thinking about how else they could fulfill that role, or whether that is is an adaptive role or a dysfunctional role, and I think that I think you could transplant that into general psychiatry psychiatry, mental health treatment, and get people to look at, the role that medication, whether it's antidepressants or benzodiazepines or whatever, the role that is having in someone's life, how it is affecting them, how it might be dampening their sensitivity to situations that maybe they shouldn't be tolerating. And then also, of course, to help them as people, if people do, want to come off, helping people to deal with the emotions that come up that have been suppressed by the use of the substance. So that's another thing that people do a lot of in substance misuse, in my experience, helping people to find other ways to manage emotions other than, stymieing them with drugs, with alcohol or drugs.
I am not a abstinence-focused type of person myself in treatment, but I do think, there are lots of issues in substance treatment, and some of that has to do with the fact that, when you have a vulnerable and stigmatized population, you do not get resources. That's just the general workings of the world, right? That, if you are stigmatized, if you are vulnerable, that you do not get care. Care is individualized for the poor and, those in need. So, substance treatment model does follow this, unfortunately, in various ways. I think there is a real attempt to try to get people to explore a lot of the trauma, but it is wholly inadequate. A lot of treatments being 30 days, 60 days, if your insurance pays 60 days with no aftercare is basically setting up a lot of people for failure. But again, going back to the topic at hand, I think, generally we should be doing this with health in general, right? Whether it's mental health, physical health, that people, I know people that pop, one of my friends just as routine pops Tylenol every day before he goes to bed. And I just noticed him doing it, and I was just like, "Oh, do you have back pain, or what's going on?" And it was one of those things where he got injured and he just got into the habit of taking it every night. Yeah. So he's been doing that for years and years and years. And I was like, "Well, do you still have back pain?" He's like, "I don't know."
Right.
Right. So it's kind of, we have this very casual relationship, I think, with drugs in general that should be examined more, that people should know, the impacts of medication to their, body and what it's doing. Because it's important to know, especially as medicine gets more complicated, right? The medications can become, a lot of stronger medications. Something that has great impact to your system also has a potential for great adverse events.
Yes. One of the things that Bill Bronston, who was a former guest of ours, who wrote the expose of Willowbrook and has used his life basically to fight against residential and abusive drug treatments and incarcerations, really. He has spoken a great deal. He has a lot to do with medical aid for Cuba. And he says when he goes there, it's amazing. People seem so happy. Now, there is a doctor for every 12 citizens. And when they decided to get their people healthy, they stopped, they did everything they could to stop people from smoking. And they substituted coffee for rum and other drinks to make around socialization. And it's had a huge health benefit, so that now they outlive Americans, that poor little island. And so it does kind of show the social effects and the concern for basic health, as Ikoi says, are so powerful in terms of allowing people to live and live happier lives. It's amazing.
Yeah, I have as promised, a dumb question, because I think just Well, yeah, just in terms of, because just as a side, I think, the book details various issues with each kind of different psychiatric drug, and it talks about coming off them. And I think there's details there that we're just not going to be able to do justice to in the time we have. And also there's that whole thing about like not taking medical advice from podcasts, like, you got to consult your provider and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's definitely worth checking out the book. It's really, really good. So my dumb question really is that how far as a term does anyone sort of stretch the word drug? Because to some degree, food is a drug, right? Like if I eat a pastry, it's going to make me feel pretty thrilled for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So where does a drug sort of begin and end in terms of definition?
What a smart question.
Well, there's, I think, drugs by impact, but I think, in terms of what we're talking about for this subject, we are talking about gate-kept drugs that are prescription drugs that must be prescribed by a doctor.
That's a good answer. And obviously that fits the theme. But beyond the theme of this conversation, then, do you have any other?
I mean, I would say a drug is a chemical substance that interacts with the biology of the body.
That's good.
Yeah.
But how you and I think it's important to recognise that there is no fundamental distinction between the drugs that people use on the street or in parties recreationally and the drugs that are prescribed by doctors. They're all chemical substances that affect our biology in various ways.
Right. I think there are some differences in terms of purity, quality, knowing that there are no adulterants.
There are lots of differences, but they're not different sorts of things.
No,
they are the same. The definition holds.
Yeah. I mean, by definition, the other difference is that by definition, street drugs are enjoyable to take for some people, whereas a lot of the prescribed drugs that affect the brain, for example, antipsychotics, are generally experienced as being very unpleasant to take.
Right.
But that doesn't.
Well, I mean, recreational.
Yeah.
And street drugs is a little bit different because you can take benzodiazepines recreationally. The core element of street drugs is, again, that you don't know the purity. You don't even know what you're getting is what you're getting, and that's ultimately what makes them more higher
dangerous.
risk.
One overlap that I think is really interesting is that a lot of people are using street drugs, and you referred to this earlier, to deal with trauma and anxiety and previous experiences of abuse and all that sort of thing. So people are often self-medicating. That would be one way of putting it, I suppose.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
But that doesn't mean that they're not getting high as well. It's all It's all very complicated. I mean, opiates are emotional anesthetics as well as being physical anesthetics. So I've definitely come across many opiate addicts who are using them to numb, terrible, bad feelings about all the terrible experiences that they've endured in their lives.
Right. I mean, it's actually, now that you mentioned that, it is also interesting how much drugs that we may not think of as mind-altering drugs has the potential to impact behavior. They've done studies of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs and how people taking them actually have expressed a small but measurable amount of lack of empathy. Wow. For example, with painkillers, right? That when you dampen certain pathways, that it has real behavioral consequences, even though we don't think of things like Advil as potentially impacting our empathy, but it can. I know people that have taken antibiotics and had hallucinations.
Yeah.
Wow.
From antibiotics.
Lots of drugs, that are not given for mental health problems, nevertheless affect the brain in one way or another. I mean,
right.
An example.
Right. So
yeah, lots of others.
Right.
So how does an apple strudel affect my behavior? That's the big question. I'm just sort of spitballing just because I'm aware that we're coming up to the end of the hour. So I don't know if there are any sort of kind of final thoughts or anything you feel like maybe we've missed out.
I think the one thing that I'd like to say is that, what we have in the medical model is an expedience model rather than a patient-centered model, where patients aren't often given, education to either advocate for themselves as well as options, right? That you rarely ever get options. You go and a doctor doesn't sit you down and go, here are your options. It's usually like, here are the pills, go to the pharmacy. Take them. So I think one of the necessary changes to the medical model is also like an administrative friendly model, right? Where if you have this disease, it's not disease isn't individualized. It's almost a flowchart model now, right? Where a doctor doesn't really look at you as a person, look at, everything. Right. They don't have the time, There are many doctors. Well, I mean, I think there are many doctors that are really, really interested and would love to provide much more individualized care that they just can't under our current model.
Joanna, did you have any sort of closing thoughts or anything you feel we've missed out?
There was a point earlier when you were talking about the consequences of being on psychiatric drugs for long periods of time, and the idea that this idea that it might be a relief. Telling someone they've got a brain disease might be a relief for people in the short term, but there are studies that show, and I'm quite sure about this as well, watching my patients, that in the long term it's really fundamentally disempowering and leads actually to chronicity and to feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, and also that it prevents people from having the learning opportunities that enable them to develop as people, to develop their confidence and develop their abilities, and realize, going back to something that Harriet was saying, that realize that we can get through difficult times, and actually that is what life is. It is about learning how to deal with challenges, and that when one does, actually they generally get easier to deal with. So I think this mass use of antidepressants is really stymieing people's personal development.
It's also stymieing their political development, because you don't have to get through it alone is part of the message as well. That you need to work to get through it, but not all by yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Short quote from your book: drugs are blunt instruments, and they are unlikely to represent the solution to many problems.
Yeah, that's a good quotation.
Thank you.
Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons: Alex Placito, Bruce Rogers-Vaughan, Jennifer Cox, Rebecca Johns, Seamus O'Connell, and Sheena Belmas.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.